Thank you. Well, my plan here is to describe two projects and to explain why, from an R&D perspective, I call this work on explosions in North Korea old, and why a new project on data rescue I would characterize as new, and why I think it's important. Now, to begin, since most of you in the room are not seismologists, let me remind you of the most basic features. Is shown a seismogram recorded in China of a Soviet underground test in 1989. And you see the most basic feature are several different waves, just simply recordings of how the ground moves in China due to that distant explosion. The first arriving P waves with longitudinal particle motion, later arriving shear waves with, in this cartoon, motion transverse to the direction of propagation, and then the arriving surface waves. And when we talk about P waves, they can arrive by a number of different paths. So often the first arriving has this fastest path traveling at the top of the mantle to a station, compared to the slightly later arrival at the distances important for monitoring North Korea quite often, is the so-called PG wave, which basically is rather like the way that optical light is trapped inside a fiber, a low velocity channel. And I'm going to describe then these two projects, old and new. First, North Korea. And as you see this map, one of the main points to make is that there are quite extensive monitoring resources. Here shown is the North Korean nuclear test site. Important for the R&D community is an open station in China, jointly operated with the US Geological Survey, at a distance of somewhat less than 400 kilometers to the north. The International Monitoring System has its stations in Russia, in South Korea, in Japan, hundreds of additional stations in Japan operated for purposes of study of earthquakes, and in China, as I'll be describing, there have been a number of temporary stations providing data to Western scientists, and more than 1,000 internal stations. So we can get data and analyze them, for example, most quickly, as I've just said, for the R&D community, from that station MDJ to the north of the test site at a distance of less than 400 kilometers. And we found with the first nuclear explosion that the ratio of the strength of P waves to S waves is diagnostic of whether the source type is earthquake or explosion. There was intense interest in the very first explosion. When the second occurred, we were able quickly to show that by making measurements of the relative arrival time at a common station between these two explosions, nearly 3 years apart, that from measuring that relative arrival time at different azimuths from the test site, we could get relative locations with precision at the level of a few hundred meters. In 2013, there were eventually some radionuclide releases detected, but that didn't happen in the first of the two explosions this year, so far as I'm aware from any published reports. The same can be said of the one last month. And what happens in the future? I have no more ability than anyone else to predict what happens next. But the main work then of how to discriminate between explosions and earthquakes was thoroughly demonstrated to be adequate very quickly for identifying, purely by seismic means, let alone public announcements from North Korea, on the nature of the source of the signals recorded from even the very first explosion, which was quite small, on the order of a kiloton. So just looking at the 5 separate nuclear tests recorded at that common station, MDJ, nearly 400 kilometers to the north, on a display that has the same amplitude in the vertical direction. So the actual amplitude is preserved because traced is the first one, very small. The next one on the order of 5 or 6 times larger, then larger again in 2013, slightly smaller, the first one this calendar year, and the most recent one, by far the largest of all 5, quite a range of amplitudes. You see the first arriving wave from the mantle, the wave that's trapped in the crust, and it's the relatively small size of the shear waves, labeled in this case LG, compared to the P waves. It's so small compared to the P waves, it's diagnostic of these being from explosion sources, and there are surface waves also to look at that indicate a very shallow source. I should note that the International Monitoring System very promptly arranges for the recent tests reports under the nature of the treaty. It's not the responsibility of the organization in Vienna to do the work of identifying the nature of the source of the observed signals, but to provide data to states parties to the treaty. However, they do promptly report on, for example, how many of their stations provide useful detections, and this is a display of the seismic stations from the International Monitoring System in a report that was made available within 24 hours of that event. Now, I will also add that I've said the smallest explosion was the first one on the order of a kiloton. We can actually do the work of monitoring hundreds of times down in size of signal from that first explosion, and there's a poster here that goes into more detail, poster number 28, that discusses an interesting seismic event that did occur on the test site in May of 2010 with signals about 300 times smaller than that very first known nuclear explosion. My colleagues and I at Lamont regard these signals as coming from, they have the characteristics of being like an earthquake. Now, let's talk about some things that aren't directly science here. China, the most populous country in the world, has a really appalling history of catastrophic earthquakes. One of them killed 500,000 people. China has 17,000 people working in the China Earthquake Administration. China operates more than 1,000 broadband stations sending data in near real time by satellite link to headquarters in Beijing, and a comparable number to the one shown here, in addition, operated at the provincial level. That data, unfortunately, for the most part, is not available to Western scientists, but what is really, I believe, of considerable interest for the 2 tests so far this calendar year is that the community of research scientists in China is promptly publishing their own analyses of seismic data from the North Korean explosions. So this is really quite significant. So shown here for the most recent test in North Korea, published by a small group in the University of Science and Technology of China. I received within 24 hours a notice that the analysis had been done showing the 2 signals from 2009 and the most recent explosion at pairs of signals recorded at a station in purple, these ones, in red, these ones, and so on, and also Japan, which makes data from hundreds of stations openly available, unlike China, the pairs of signals and so on. So quickly from analysis of pairs of signals like this, it becomes possible to get these relative locations. So from that same group in China, widely circulated was their map of the relative location of all 5 of the North Korean nuclear test explosions. And you see here on this scale, 2 kilometers east-west, So there are two at about the same latitude, northern, and another two slightly further to the south, all somewhat to the west of the very first explosion in 2006. And here you see that set of locations laid on a topographic map. A few weeks later, I think about 2 or 3 weeks later, I received the notice of a preprint from the Journal of Geophysical Journal International from a group in Norway, and also with a contributor from Los Alamos, Frank Pabian, essentially just that same diagram, in which the paper had been written just from the first 4 tests, but they were able to do the analysis of the 5th test and get it into the online version of their just published paper, and it's the same diagram. So the most recent test, the one just a few weeks ago, at about the same latitude as the other one this calendar year, the other two slightly to the south, and all distance to the west from the first one. So, I mean, it's wonderful now that lots of groups are doing this type of analysis. It's not quite crowdsourcing. These are still specialized scientific studies, but a lot of people now are applying the methods that were very quickly developed for the first few test explosions of North Korea, which are the only nuclear test explosions of the present century. And between them and what the P5 states did up to 1996, only India and Pakistan have carried out this testing activity in 1998. So that's my rush through what I regard as rather the old feature of, from the R&D perspective of North Korean tests. Now let me talk about data rescue. And the broad picture is to make the point that seismology is an observational science, and archives of seismograms are important to build up our experience of how to do the work of monitoring. This is my most important graphic for this supposedly 20-minute talk, and I'm going to show it to you from the bottom up. It's a series of timelines. All testing was only in the atmosphere in the early decades, the 40s and the 50s, and then a handful of underground tests developed. Broadly speaking, the practice of testing in the atmosphere ended in 1963, with a few exceptions from France and China, who also eventually stopped that practice. And testing then went underground, both literally and metaphorically, for several decades. In this first 20 years, these are the numbers of explosions per decade for different countries. So huge numbers of both atmospheric and underground tests by the two superpowers in these 2 decades from 1960 to 1980. All of that data, all of that practice is documented only with analog recordings. That is to say, a pen writing on paper, or a photo beam writing on photosensitive paper. And my subject, seismology, took up digital recording somewhat slowly in the 60s and 70s, but it really took off only in the 1980s. And now to look at these timelines. I was born in the 1940s, so I'm be departing the scene eventually. I'm not immortal, I'm told. So I think most students in the room were born within about 5 years, I'm guessing, from 1990. So students born around 1990 simply have no experience. Indeed, students born even in the 2 earlier decades in their PhD studies and productive years have almost no experience with analog seismograms. And so these are all the good points that could be made about that body of data. Most of the data from atmospheric explosions, certainly, and most underground explosions, is associated with analog recordings that are held in millions of seismograms in the United States. These are not science problems. This is a management problem, how to access this data and make it available for future generations as well as the current generations of PhD students. So on the bottom right, you see Ina Sokolova, with whom I worked for about 20 years in a team in Kazakhstan that successfully acquired the analog recordings from the stations you see on this map, and in a 20-year project, for example, in this map of the Kazakhstan semi-polygon and the nuclear tests there, these series of hundreds of analog stations, we acquired the analog seismograms, scanned them, digitized them, and put them in a modern database. Here is a digitized atmospheric nuclear explosion profile. This is the United States. This is Grable, 1953. The only data we have from this is all analog recording. And people don't, unless you're on the inside, know what is available or how to access the data if you want to do quantitative studies of this type of phenomenon. So there's a list of potential projects you can see here. And my final graphic is this one, to make again the point that seismology is an observational science, and it will be some years of work to organize the community to see what subset of analog seismograms we decide are worth preserving, to find them, to scan them, to associate them with the metadata of instrument responses and time corrections, a lot of really boring stuff. But if we don't do this, I think we will have failed to provide adequate documentation of one of the most extraordinary practices in which Homo sapiens has ever indulged, the execution of more than 2,000 nuclear test explosions. For an observational science, the principal data set currently is not available to the research community. And I would hope that professional societies and the work, the leadership work on this is being done largely in countries in Europe. I'm slowly finding out more about the work being done in China to preserve analog data. So it's an ongoing project that no one person, no one institution can really solve. I simply wanted to talk about it to bring it to the attention of the CVT. Thank you.
The height of burst depth of burial ranged from -1 buried below the surface to 4 meters above the surface, and the shape and size of the charge was also varied. This series included repeated explosions.